Steve, you were at Drake University in Iowa for just 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reason for that?
You mean what was the reason why I wasn't there for 2, 3, or 4 years? The scholarship was for 1 year, and it ran out, and I didn't have the money to continue. Isn't that sad?
Yeah.
But life went on. But I was very happy in Des Moines. It's interesting, as all of us look back on our lives, and I hope we all do at one point or another, to notice how many times things that seemed like bad breaks turned out to, in the long run, make sense somehow. Because if I had had a longer scholarship, I might be working in Des Moines today, and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of great people are. But it obviously wasn't the ideal situation for me. Somehow the scattered irregularity of my whole life. I attended 18 schools in all, for example. That's not a way to get educated. But as Shakespeare said, it's an ill wind that blows no good, and even war, pestilence, all the rotten things, they're always good for the undertakers and the ambulance driver. So no matter what tragedy, literally, can be specified, it produces some effects for somebody, the casket makers or whoever they are.
Well, it got you hooked on radio, didn't it?
Yeah, sure. The year there did get me interested in radio. I was also then interested in, obviously, journalism, because that was my rationale for being there in the first place. But I noticed something quite fascinating. The school, as do many colleges around the world, would have professionals in various fields come in. The doctors would come in and talk to the medical students, and the historians to the history students, and so forth. So we would have journalists come and talk to us, and we would have radio people. And with all due respect to radio people and radio itself, and I still love it and still do it, I immediately saw that the journalists that came in were sharp as tacks. Boy, they were so erudite and articulate and knowledgeable about the world. And the same could not be said of most of the radio guys that came in. They were, jovial, good fellows, and I loved them. But I thought, it's going to be a lot easier if I'm in with those guys, rather than in with the people that really have been better educated and are more knowledgeable about the world. So I'm not sure that was my full motivation, but the thought did cross my mind. So it turned out to be easier to get into radio.
And you got your first job in 1942 in Phoenix, didn't you?
Yes. Again, for breathing purposes only, I had to move back to Arizona.
How did that come about, that job?
Well, I entered myself in my second year college. I didn't want to just sit around and look out the window, so I went to what is now a major university called Arizona State University, big football. It has about 50,000 students. In my day, there were 1,500 students in the student body, and I loved it. It was like Drake. It was a small school, and you got to know everybody that way. So this now was during the World War II period, and how much longer any of us young guys were going to be able to walk the streets, we didn't know. The draft was always pretty close down the line, and eventually I did get drafted and was in the Army. But in the meantime, since you don't know when that particular moment will come, you go along as if it's not going to come, and then change your plans as they must be changed. So I attended auditions, or asked for auditions, and was given them at some local stations in Phoenix. And one of the stations called me back and offered me full-time work. And I thought, I'll have to quit school, and I don't like to do that. But on the other hand, if I don't take this job, I'll probably be back here 3 years later looking for the same job. So what the hey, I'll quit. So I never was in a school on a formal basis after that.
That station was KOY.
Yes, that was my first full-time job. I had done a little amateur work or semi-pro work in Phoenix at station KPHO. I had a pal from high school days, and we're still friends, a fellow named Ted Edmondson, very good-looking gentleman who's a singer, sort of a cowboy-type singer, nice voice, played guitar, and I played the piano. And we had done a little entertaining together. So, but you're right, the first full-time, really professional job was at KOY. And my 3 years there were very happy.
What'd you do? What were your duties on that first show?
Well, I was hired as an announcer, which is the least demanding job known to human history. But once they discovered that I could do other things, they said, in effect, go ahead, do them all. They didn't pay me anymore. But so in about a year, I was writing most of the commercial copy for the station, the commercials, obviously. and writing news, and they even had a soap opera drama show there. I sometimes would write a little scene or two for that. And they gave me my own music show. I played the piano and sang. I was called the Melody Man. Yeah, that was it, the Melody Man. And was doing some production, and had met another new friend then, a fellow named Wendell Noble, who was on the staff. And Wendell was a funny fellow. He had a cute sense of humor. So we got together and did a comedy act around Phoenix. We'd play little dinners and dances and clubs. We had such great experiences as one night we were entertaining at Luke Field, which was a training base for pilots during the war. And we were told by the major that hired us that we were to be the entertainment for a graduating class of young flyers. So great. I think it paid $75, and that was big money to us anyway in those days. So I used to do very different comedy in those days. I believe it or not, I had my teeth blacked out, and I wore a silly kind of a Pinky Lee hat and did really goofy stuff. People laughed, but it was different. So Wendell came out and sang, and the audience loved his singing. And then he said, now here's my friend. And I wasn't introduced to Steve Allen. I was called Claude Horribly. I think that was my silly last name. And when I entered, I got a scream. I thought, hey, this is going to be a picnic tonight. Boy, they love even before I do joke. Well, the next 12 minutes were a nightmare because not a single joke got any laugh at all. I don't mean weak laughter or bored, snoring or whatever. No sound whatever. And I look out, they're still smiling at us. I thought, what the hell is this? So when you're a comic and you're getting no laughs, you go into a kind of a Twilight Zone daze. You keep your mouth moving. You're a professional. But by the time you walk off stage, you're dazed. So here the mayor comes up to us backstage and says, hey, guys, you're great. Here's your check. Beautiful. I'll call you soon. I said, what do you mean beautiful? They didn't laugh. He said, how could they laugh? They're all from China. They were a young class of Chinese flying cadets. He never told us this before the show, or we would have done more music. Okay. But anyway, that's the kind of life that Wendell and I had as comics. And it was, all in all, a very happy 3 years.
A lot of fun. But in 1942, I guess, is when the draft caught up with you.
Yes. When I began to get the formal communications, I reported as ordered, and I said, let me explain something to you. I'm not trying to get out of service. I'll be glad to do whatever my nation wants. But I am living in Arizona because I'm an asthmatic and I couldn't survive in Iowa or Illinois. And I said, make of that what you will, but that's the situation, So if they had listened to me, they would have said, oh, well, then get out of here. We need nothing but healthy young fellows. But anyway, I got drafted and went through the basic training. And there were pluses to it. I know now how to use a machine gun, how to use an M1 rifle, how to carry a mortar and fire mortars and all that stuff. If you ever need a mortar or a machine gun, I'm your man. But of course, once they had me running up hills in California, around Paso Robles and San Luis Obispo, where we were trained, the asthma came back. And sergeants still like to hear you going up a hill going, So they mustered me out, as we say, just before they ran out of mustard, I guess. Anyway, because of the asthma, they sent me back home.
In 1944 now, I'm jumping to there, you moved to Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And tell me about that career move.
Well, in those days in radio, come to think of it, it might even still be true, I'm not sure, guys who see some chance of getting up in the world, if they are in radio, generally start in a small community, East Overshoe, Idaho, or whatever it is. And that's not a bad way to break in, because they don't watch you at NBC in New York. They got, pros there. And you're only 19 out of college, so you start at a small town. And then finally you move from that. If you're making progress and getting better at your trade, you might move to Denver or Dallas or some other city. Then if you're in the West, your real target is Los Angeles, because that's the big time, or the biggest time anyway. So that's how I ended up out of Arizona and into Los Angeles. Now, the process in the East was you were headed for New York, and in the Midwest, you were headed for Chicago, if you had the stuff and were lucky. So that's how I got here. I was aiming at that with such determination, in fact, that I had 2 jobs for the last year or so in Phoenix. During the day, I worked at the radio station, and at night, I played piano and sang at a club which is possibly still there. It was a nice restaurant called the Steakhouse. I'm pretty sure that was the title. the high point of my experience there, I was working with a little trio, and one night I stood up to sing a great old song of the 1930s called She's Funny That Way. It starts, I'm not much to look at, not much to see. And the guy at the bar turns around and yells, you can say that again, Mac. Got a big laugh, and it hurt my little feelings. He was right. Anyway, that enabled me to save an extra $1,000. So as soon as I had $1,000 in the bank, I kissed my wife and my little baby a very brief and temporary bye-bye, because I had to go over there first to find a room. And I was told, you'll never find a room in Los Angeles. That tiresome old line, don't you know there's a war going on? You heard that about 12 times a day in those days. But they were right. L.A. was crowded with Marines and sailors, and it was hopeless. But, of course, there's always some hope. So I finally found a terrible room. And that enabled me to sink a little root or two into the soil here in L.A. And then I had better luck after that and moved up into network radio.
What are your memories of L.A. at that time, insofar as show business or radio went? In the movies, did you have?
Well, yes, it was radio was still the big glamour thing. I guess experimentally, now we can read in the textbooks that they were monkeying with one TV camera in Kansas City or something, but the nation was not plugged into television as yet. So radio was all the glamour I needed. I remember one night I was around Vine Street. I don't remember why I was there. And they were passing out tickets to a show that was very big in the world then, not just in America. It was called Command Performance. And in addition to being heard here, it was also aired all over the world to, as we say, our boys overseas. And this particular night, the star happened to be Bob Hope. And part of the excitement was when you got the ticket and went into the theater there on Vine Street, you didn't know who the stars were because it didn't say. They printed them up weeks ahead. It turned out to be Bob Hope. Now, Bob was probably America's most popular comedian of the century. In fact, he raced probably. But when I remember when he walked on stage, when he was suddenly sprung on us, guess who it is tonight, folks? Here's Bob Hope. He got a 3-minute ovation. Nobody jumped up or anything, but we simply applauded for 3 minutes just because he was standing there. And I remember articulating the thought, because I was already doing a little bit of comedy, wow, this is what comes of sticking to it and being good and doing well and having good luck. Eventually, it doesn't even matter what you do. They love you just for being there that night, you know? And all the successful entertainers, whether comedians, tap dancers, trumpet players, whoever they are, eventually achieve something like that level, not the eminence of a Bob Hope. That's a freaky thing. But if you are, again, successful and hang around for enough years, you get a kind of respect which need not necessarily any longer relate much to how talented you are. In fact, some old-timers are in a little trouble on the talent scale, but America still loves them. I'm not talking about Bob in that regard.
No. But you did find an interest in being in his shoes as being that popular and being that loved.
It already confirmed what I had now begun to realize was a path I was somehow stumbling along. It wasn't a consciously formalized desire, because I was interested in writing and music and piano playing and recording and all that. But comedy was clearly going to be part of the total package. So yeah, I could see that it's nice to be doing comedy and have the public appreciate what you do.
You went to radio station KFAC.
My very first job in L.A., after walking the streets, as we say, for 3 weeks, I auditioned at 3 or 4 stations, and oddly enough, in the 4th week, when I had begun to run out of that $1,000 stash, and was even thinking, God, do I have to go back to Arizona and start all over again? 3 stations called me. And so I asked, of course, what does it pay? And I just took the one that paid the most. That's simple. I figured they're all equal. They're all local stations. And that was, as you've said, KFAC down on Wilshire Boulevard. It was a classical music station. And my job was one for which I was utterly unqualified. I grew up loving popular music and loving jazz and knowing zero about classical music. When I heard it, I enjoyed it. It wasn't like I said, oh, that's terrible. I recognized genius when I heard it, but knew nothing about it. And I used to envy these announcers who, when they would mention a German song, would speak with a German, in other words, correctly pronouncing the German words or the French words or the Italian words. It was all double talk to me. It all sounded like Sid Caesar sounds now when he does those double talk language things. Nevertheless, I had been hired, and I got the lousiest duty. The new man always gets the worst duty. In my case, it was midnight to 5 or 6 in the morning. So I was getting laughs that I really wasn't entitled to because of my ignorance. All the records in those days were on 78 revolutions per minute speed. And the record companies hadn't planned it too well. Of course, they didn't know about radio. They were just playing for home use. You'd start with the first movement of somebody's symphony on side 1, and then the second was on side 2. So there had to be 14 seconds of silence while you lifted it off, turned it over, put it back down. And I don't think I ever played a single symphony in the proper sequence. I didn't care. It was 3 in the morning. Who was listening anyway, I figured.
But you didn't fill in with any ad-libs between movements.
A little bit, but again, I knew enough not to try to do comedy in the middle of Beethoven's Fifth. That wouldn't have been appropriate. That's an interesting point, by the way. I think some of today's comedians should more occasionally ask themselves, yeah, I got a funny line I could use here, but should I? Because there may be children in the audience, there may be 400 nuns on a convention, whatever it is. Sometimes the answer is no, jerk, you shouldn't. So just step over it and go back to work.
I'm going to jump, excuse me, Steve, I'm going to jump to 1946, where you were reunited with Wendell Noble in Los Angeles. You had worked with him before. Tell me about the radio program that you two did.
Yeah, Wendell by now had begun to do all right for himself. He was a staff announcer at station KHJ, which is a mutual radio network station. It was down on Melrose. The building, in fact, is still there. It's right next door to Paramount Studios. And I would see him and his wife socially, and we'd hang out together as friends. So we noticed, as we sort of analyzed the local radio situation, even the network situation, that some of the shows were pretty bad. And that's always going to be true in show business. Some plays are pretty bad. In the cultural arts, there's more garbage than there is genius. So Wendell went to his superior, a very nice man named Tony Lafrano, who was the program manager at KHJ, and he said what I had suggested he say, which was this. He said, Tony, some of those shows you have on in the morning schedule, I won't say whether they're good or bad, but you know what they are. But I will say this, my friend Steve Allen and I could do a better show than some of those. And thank God Tony was a rational man, because he could have said, oh, well, I'll call you when I need you, and not called us. But he actually said, well, if that's right, then you ought to be on the air and those shows off. I said, great, that's what we're trying to lead you to say, And it worked out wonderfully. He said, okay, I can't hire just people on talk. He said, but put together a couple of shows, audition, pilot shows, whatever you want to call it. And if I like them, we'll see what happens. So we did 2 shows, one on each side of a big, enormous glass disc, which they used to record on in those days.
You and Wendell wrote those shows?
Yeah. There wasn't much writing to the first one because it was just called Wendell and Steve, and it consisted of me playing the piano, Wendell singing, occasionally our doing vocals together in 2-part harmony, and just a little sprinkling of jokes and time signals. Well, it's now 7:47 in the morning, up and out of bed, or whatever we would say. And that was one. The other side, it was comedy, definitely. He sang a little less, I sang a little less, I played a little less piano, and we did actual jokes and sketches. We played straight for each other because he did some dialects, and although I don't do dialects, I did my characters like Claude Horribly. And I don't know whether it was a flip of the coin or Tony Lafrano's taste, but he picked the funny one. And here we are, 2 young punks, about 25 years old at the time, really green behind the whatever. And suddenly we had our own coast-to-coast radio show every morning at 7:15 to 7:30. Parenthetically, the young man who followed us from San Francisco was a then unknown singer named Merv Griffin. I should have invested with him in those days instead of Wendell.
In 1948, you were hired by LA radio station KNX, a CBS radio affiliate, for a late night show. How did that come about?
Well, I'd never have known how they happened to call me. Obviously, they had heard the Smile Time show, knew a little about me from around town. And a very nice man named Maury Webster was the program manager, and I think the station manager was a fellow named Hal Hudson, CBS guys. So First I should explain that Smile Time after 2 years went off. Most of my shows that went off, I never knew to this day why they went off.
Maybe you were never told.
They tell you thanks a lot, it's been nice working with you, and they put something else on. And so what? You're off. Who cares whether you found out the reason? But suddenly, after 2 years, wow, our own network show, we were just two young guys out of work again. And oddly enough, Wendell and I were never able thereafter to find work together. So we went our separate ways. We remained friends, but our separate ways professionally. He went back to concentrating on singing. He was also very active in Mormon affairs. He was a Mormon churchman. And so after a few worrisome days, I just got a call out of the blue from one of the fellows at the CBS station and said, we'd like you to come over here and do a late night record show for us. And my heart sank at that. First of all, I was going from network back to local, which is a step in the wrong direction. And secondly, playing records, which I thought was a fate worse than death. But you have to eat. So I accepted the work. And after, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 weeks on the air, I began not consciously thinking it through, but just doing it, playing a little less recorded music and talking a little more. I had no far-seeing plan, whatever. It was just a tendency that emerged. And as soon as that started, the show got better and got popular. And I could tell by the mail and comment on the street and so forth. You can tell when something's working out. They tell you, the world lets you know. So things were going great, and I cut down from about 8 records per show to about 3, and was doing much more talking, more playing the piano. I had a piano moved into the studio, and I would sing and talk about songs that Frank Sinatra had just sung, and I show how they were originally wrote the chorus before the little bits I knew about the music business. And I was very happy. And then one day, Maury Webster called me into his office, and he said, we got a problem. I said, oh, what's that? Because I thought the show was going great. He said, well, you do remember what we hired you to do, don't you? I said, yeah. He said, you're not doing it. And I said, that's true, but I think I'm doing something better. And he said, well, he said, that's always hard to say. He said, but he said, the talk around the building is maybe you should just, because people do love to hear those great songs and play more records. So I thought, oh, swell, back in the wrong direction again. And then I did either a brilliant or a dangerous thing. I read Maury's memo. He also sent me a memo about it. I read it on the air. And I said, folks, let me tell you, I just got this. And I read a whole 2-page memo. It couldn't have worked out better. I got what turned out to be a big grocery box, over 400 letters from people, all on my side. Some of them were very angry at him, didn't even know the poor guy. He was a nice guy. And so therefore, after about 4 days of mail deliveries, and I'd seen all the letters were saying the same thing, I walked into his office with the box, and I said, Maury, you got a minute? Yeah. I said, here's mail I've gotten in the last few days. He hadn't been listening to me, so he didn't know why I got it. And I said, I think it'll make sense if you sample it or read a few and you'll see what it is. He said, all right, leave it over there. So a couple of days later, nice ending. It was like Tony LaFrando's Rationality, which helped earlier. He said, you are right. Now, how many bosses ever say that? That's pretty rare. Even when you are right, they don't want to let you know it, So he said, okay, go ahead. He said, but now and then play a little record so, I can win a little piece of the game. And that's how it turned out. And then at that point, the show just took off as an out-and-out comedy show.
The show became so popular, I understand, that listeners came to the station to see you do your
Initially,
report.
we didn't even have tickets. All radio shows that had audiences had tickets for them, still do. But people began to drop down, sometimes just friends, and if you have 5 or 6 people in the studio laughing, they sound like 18 people. It's the sound of in the room. And then, of course, once it sounded as if 18 people were laughing, then we got a lot of letters saying, hey, you have an audience now. Can I come down some night? So the thing grew very quickly, just within 3 or 4 months. And at the end of the process, the CBS had moved us into the Studio A, where Jack Benny and the Biggies used to do their shows, which seated 1,000 people. So, and we would do 2 shows on a Friday night so I could have Monday off. One was taped, recorded. But it was all straight ahead after that. I didn't have to prove anything to anybody.
Did you improvise a lot of that show?
Oh, yeah, there were no writers. There was a creative moment, which again was an accident, just good luck. When they decided they liked the show so much that they were going to change it from 30 minutes to 60, which itself is a lovely compliment, but with no increase in pay, I thought, I don't want to stick around the office for 2 more days. 2 more hours a day, I should say. writing more material, because I used to write like all funny people on the radio. You go to your typewriter, you write, then you stretch it out on the air. And I thought, I know what I'll do. It's the oldest thing in the world. I'll interview people, interview guests. So that worked out okay, because people like to see others interviewed.
Were these people from the audience? Or?
No, these were guest stars. Rudy Vallée, and one night we did a marvelous show with Al Jolson when he was making his comeback, and a beautiful evening with Gloria Swanson. So that part worked well. It's like a talk show today. Not many people would tune in to see a lot of talk shows if they suddenly stopped interviewing people. But anyway, the interview thing worked out well. And then one night, Doris Day, who had been scheduled and announced, didn't show up. I later learned it wasn't her fault. She had not been told about it. But there I was on the air live. I'd already played my piano numbers. I'd read the 2 or 3 pages of written comedy stuff. And I couldn't think of anything to do. So I just grabbed the old heavy floor microphones they used to use and carried it down into the studio audience. And the most remarkable thing happened. I had been getting good laughs before, but I got laughs like I'd never gotten in my life as a comic, totally ad-libbing. I don't know whether it was the desperation of the moment or what it was. I wish I had that tape. And I realized after the show, oh, yeah, I've discovered something here. 4 times the volume and frequency of the laughter on the ad-lib nonsense than I ever got reading stuff the way all the other radio comics did. So much for that for the time being. And again, I had no writers. There was one guy who was very clever. He was a fan. He used to listen to the show every night. His name was Bill Larkin. And he was my first writer. He didn't work on that show because there was no budget. But years later, I was able to hire him when I got into TV. He later went on to Many Happy Years with Bob Hope, wrote a lot of Bob's great jokes. But with that one partial exception, there was no producer, no director, nothing. It was just myself doing whatever I wanted for an hour.
Who booked the guests?
I had a secretary, a lovely English woman named Joy Russell Smith. Not funny, until you asked me, I hadn't thought of her name in a long time. And I had a one-page bio in those days. That's grown a little over the years.
Did you have a budget for guest stars?
No, they weren't paid. They all came on the same reason guests do to this day, to plug their new books, their new albums, their new movies, their new appearances in Las Vegas, or whatever they were trying to sell.
I'm going to jump to 1949, where you had your own show with your own name above the title. Mm-hmm. It was the Steve Allen Show. It was primetime radio. And was that on CBS?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. How would you compare that show to the late night radio show that you started with?
Well, the second show, which was more important, it was, again, on the network rather than just local. And for this now, we had a budget, we had writers. Madeline Pugh and Bob Carroll. Yeah, mm-hmm. Years later, they would write most of the great Lucy scripts with Jess Oppenheimer. So that was a more big league production. We had a band. I think Wilbur Hatch at one time was our orchestra leader, and then later Lud Gluskin. And we had major guest stars. In fact, somebody recently sent me a recording of the opening show of that series. It's weird since it's so important. I'd totally forgotten that among the guests were Eve Arden, Jack Benny, and Groucho Marx. A pretty big trio, considering that I was just a young, nobody as far as I could see. But it was nice of the network to give me that kind of support. So I worked for CBS in network radio doing different kinds of things for about 7 years. And then they couldn't think of anything else to do with me, so I went over to the NBC fellows for the next several years.
I want to, just before we pass it by, talk about Madeline Pugh and Bob Carroll, because they did play such an important part.
I had great fun. First of all, I'd never had writers before, so I would have loved any writing, and we really lucked it out with those two. It may sound odd that they wrote for me and then later did such great work with Lucy, because I'm nothing whatever like Lucille Ball. I'm not talking about the physicality, but our whole comedy styles are different. First of all, with Lucy, they did a situation comedy. Whereas in writing for me, they had, I think, a wider experimental canvas, because I would do any crazy thing. And I also contributed to the scripts myself. One of the routines that some people, old-timers now, still remember came one night when I said, by the way, I was pretending to be serious, but I wasn't. I said, by the way, the ratings on my show have just come in, and they're not bad, but I said, to be honest with you, I think we deserve bigger numbers than the ones I'm reading in this report. There's no report, I was just making it up. I said, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I learned recently that in the early evening, a very high percentage of American radio listeners are in automobiles. Now, I said they don't have phones in those days. They had no car phone. I said, how are they going to find out if you're listening? They can't. So I'm being deprived of what I bet are 12 million viewers, listeners.